Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today I'm coming at you with a video where we're going to break down the initial 53-man roster for the Detroit Lions, as well as a few of the roster moves that were made right after the initial 53-man roster was made. However, before we get into that, I would like to, at this time, ask you to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment down in the comment section below for that YouTube algorithm. So, to start out with, the Detroit Lions only had 52 players on their initial 53-man roster, leaving it open for a waiver wire claim, or at least that's what I believe it was left open for. And now that we're a little bit further in time, it's just about 3:45 as of recording this, we know who that waiver wire claim was, and we'll talk about that when we get to his section of this video here. I initially thought that 53rd spot was going to be claiming Tim Patrick, either off of waivers or just by signing him straight onto the roster. However, it seems right now that the Lions are looking to play a little bit of, roster games with the players that they have right now. I believe they're going to try to sneak maybe one or two players onto the practice squad that might have gotten claimed if they had waived them right after the cut deadline, which we will also talk about here in this video. Moving on to the quarterbacks, the Lions only kept two on the roster, which is not surprising. I don't really think you need a third quarterback, really. And with the Lions' proposed rule from last season now being voided, or at least changed, that a third quarterback has to be on the roster to be in emergency elevation. It can't be on the practice squad, which, as far as I'm concerned, was the whole reason for having the emergency third quarterback rule, was so that you could keep an extra roster spot open. But that rule has been revoked. The quarterback that is going to be eligible to be activated in an emergency scenario now is just someone that is listed as an inactive player but is on the roster itself. I still don't particularly believe that you need three quarterbacks. Chances are, if Hendon Hooker has to go into the game, we're going to lose anyway, and if Hendon Hooker gets hurt, just have somebody go back there and hand the ball off for the rest of the game. I don't particularly think you need a third quarterback on the roster. That being said, it is actually nice to have a third quarterback, one that can effectively just run the scout team, while Hendon Hooker, the actual backup quarterback, works with Jared Goff in understanding the offense in case Hendon Hooker has to come into the game. And of the two other quarterbacks that the Lions had during camp and preseason football here, those were Jake Fromm and Nate Sudfeld. Now, I don't want to see Nate Sudfeld in the NFL anymore, let alone on the Lions. So I would hope that Jake Fromm, who in the very little action he did get in the final preseason game, actually looked significantly better than Nate Sudfeld ever looked this entire preseason. I would hope that Jake Fromm would be the choice to go on the practice squad, not Nate Sudfeld, or at least someone that isn't Nate Sudfeld, if I'm just being honest with you. I don't want to see him get an NFL paycheck because he does not deserve it. Now, the four running backs that are on the roster are Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, Craig Reynolds, Sione Vaki. Those are the four guys, and all four of them are very likely to be on the active roster for the vast majority of games this season, mainly for special teams in the case of Sione Vaki and Craig Reynolds, but also I do believe that you could see them rotate in if David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs gets hurt, etc., etc. As far as the practice squad goes, because there was no real surprise about the four running backs that made the roster. As far as the practice squad goes, the three guys that I'm looking at there are Jermar Jefferson, Jake Funk, or Zonovan Knight. And of those three guys, Jake Funk would be number one, Jermar Jefferson would be number two, and Zonovan Knight would be number three in terms of who I would like to see on the practice squad the most out of those three players. Moving on to wide receivers, it wasn't surprising that they only kept 4 wide receivers. If you had asked me, a month and a half ago when I started recording all those videos, that Isaiah Williams was going to make the roster, I wouldn't be surprised because I actually thought he had a draftable grade. I believe I had a 5th-round grade on him. However, I would be surprised that the Lions only kept 4 wide receivers with him being one of them. That would have surprised me. That being said, the Lions will not have 4 wide receivers on the roster in the regular season. They will have 5. Tim Patrick will be elevated from the practice squad onto the active roster at some point. I see 2 possible, maybe even probable moves that could free up roster spots on this roster after the initial 53. But before we get to those, because neither of them are in this section of the video, who else would I like to see on the practice squad? Donovan Peoples-Jones, obviously he did not play very well in the preseason. However, he is someone that maybe you would want to keep around on the practice squad. The Lions do like him, but wide receiver 3 is a massive question mark, and there's no depth beyond that. Caden Davis would also be another player that I actually thought played pretty well in the preseason that I would like to put on the practice squad. And Maurice Alexander is the final player, specifically in case Khalif Raymond gets hurt, who will likely be the returner for this team, either on punts and kickoffs or on just punts. So if he does get hurt, Maurice Alexander, I think, would be elevated to become that likely 4th wide receiver, with Tim Patrick being wide receiver 3. And then after that, have him return punts and stuff like that. This was one of the biggest surprises of the initial 53. And that is Sam Laporta and Brock Wright, who were locks. We already knew they were going to make the roster. But the 3rd tight end was Parker Hesse. And that straight up shocked me. I did not see that coming. Even when I did watch the preseason games, I didn't watch every second of all of them, but I did look at the preseason games. He was not someone that particularly stood out to me. However, I didn't watch the games like a coach would watch the games and pay attention to every specific player. So he wasn't flashy, but obviously he did enough to earn a spot on this roster. I kind of thought that Shane Zylstra was going to be that guy that would earn a spot on a roster because he made the roster the last 2 years that he was healthy. This past season, he was hurt and on the IR for the whole season. So I kind of thought Zylstra would slide back into that tight end 3 role. However, he got beat out by a younger player here. I was also a little bit surprised that James Mitchell was cut. I probably would have had James Mitchell and Shane Zylstra in terms of likelihood of making the roster, both ahead of Parker Hesse. However, that's not what happened, and I guess that's a good thing. So I do think that this is an interesting decision to run with these 3 tight ends. However, it's not out of the realm of possibility that James Mitchell or Shane Zylstra would get brought back onto the practice squad in case an injury happens to any one of these 3 tight ends. They would then get brought up off the practice squad. And actually, before we move on to offensive tackles here, I've got a little bit of an update. As I was looking over here, I decided to refresh the prideofdetroit.com website that has all of the Lions practice squad claims on here. And Jake Fromm was claimed onto the practice squad, so that's good. Love to see that for him, as well as Donovan Mitchell. And I knew 3 players, but I did not know those 2 other players, Donovan Mitchell and Jake Fromm. So I'm 2 for 2 on my predictions of going into the practice squad. I haven't looked at this in almost an hour, and I've just decided to glance over it and refresh the page. So 2 for 2 right there. So moving on to the offensive tackles, there are 5 on the roster. These are the 5 that I predicted to make the roster. Taylor Decker, Penei Sewell, obviously the starters. Dan Skipper, Colby Sorsdal, and Giovanni Manu are the backup names. As far as practice squad, I'm not really sure that they're going to keep anybody on the practice squad that was on the roster during the preseason. I believe that will likely be, if any, some outside names. This is a pretty solid group here. I like Giovanni Manu a lot. However, he is incredibly raw. I do not like this unit if Taylor Decker or Penei Sewell gets hurt. That would open up a lot of questions here. The depth is not great, but as far as the starting two guys, there might not be a better duo in the NFL. In fact, there probably isn't. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I mean, the Eagles with Lane Johnson and whoever their left tackle is, whose name is escaping me right now, would be in the discussion. I think Sewell is relatively significantly better than Lane Johnson at this point in Lane Johnson's career. And I think Taylor Decker is slightly worse than that left tackle. So I think overall, this group is still stronger. Moving on to the interior offensive linemen, there were 5 players that made the roster. And for the first time, I think there's a player here that has a significant possibility to end up getting cut and added to the practice squad. Frank Ragnow is not that guy. Neither is Graham Glasgow or Kevin Zeitler. Those are the 3 starters. And again, I'm not positive there's a better group of 3 players in the NFL. Kayode Awosika is the backup guard, I think, for either left guard or right guard. If Graham Glasgow gets hurt, Awosika would slide in at left guard, and if Zeitler would get hurt, I think Awosika would still slide in at left guard, and Graham Glasgow would go to right guard. Michael Nees is a center, and hypothetically, he is the number 2 guy on the center depth chart. However, I believe, mainly because I am of sound rational mind, that if Frank Ragnow were to get hurt, Graham Glasgow would slide over to center, and they would bring in Awosika or potentially Christian Mahogany when he comes back from injury to that guard spot. However, Christian Mahogany is still on IR. However, I believe he was put on IR with the designation to return. I don't think that was a season-ending injury for him, but it does mean that I believe he will be out for at least 4 weeks into the season. So this could end up being the group that we roll with for a while here. It would not surprise me if Michael Nees was a cut candidate, meaning that the Lions want to bring up Tim Patrick from the practice squad and onto the 53-man roster. The corresponding move might be Michael Nees getting cut and potentially taking Tim Patrick's spot on the practice squad. However, I'm not positive that Michael Nees would have made it through waivers. I think it's more likely than some other players we're going to talk about here. However, he is on the 53-man roster, and I think he's probably there to stay until Christian Mahogany comes back. And even if Christian Mahogany comes back, they might choose to keep Michael Nees, instead cutting Kayode Awosika. Moving on to the edge rusher position, this was pretty much always the group that I thought was going to make it. However, there is a notable player here, and that's John Cominsky, who I believe has suffered a season-ending injury. So I don't really know why he's on the roster, but he's listed as being on the roster. So if I had to guess, the move and corresponding move would be sending John Cominsky to the IR and elevating up potentially Tim Patrick, or maybe even just signing to the active roster. As of this moment in time, Isaac Kuwu is not claimed by anyone and has not signed by to another team as far as I'm aware. So there's a definitive possibility that we send John Cominsky to the IR and either sign Isaac Okuwu or potentially elevating Mitchell Agood from the practice squad on to the active roster. I do think that you're probably going to want to keep 5 defensive ends because, spoiler alert, we only have 4 interior defensive linemen right now, with Brock Martin on the IR designated to return. So 9 defensive linemen is just about where you want to be. So whenever they move John Cominsky to either the PUP list or the IR or whatever list they put him on, they could waive him with an injury settlement. I don't know. However, that move is going to happen, and they could be signing another player to fill that position, either a veteran or something like that, or they could use that open roster spot to bring up Tim Patrick to the active roster. So with DJ Reader activated off of the injured list, he is on the roster, as well as fellow starter Aleem McNeil. Levi Onwuzurike and Mekhi Wingo will be the primary rotation pieces along the interior. As far as the practice squad / injured reserve goes, Brock Martin is on the injured reserve. I believe he will likely be headed to the active roster when he comes back as the backup nose tackle to DJ Reader in like a true sense. Aleem McNeil would likely fill in that role when DJ Reader needs a refresh or needs to just take a break for a minute. He would likely slide over to the one technique or the nose tackle position. Kyle Peko is the other player that I think has a possibility to end up on the practice squad for the Lions. I don't believe he has signed anywhere else as of this moment in time, and he is a veteran that has been around the league for a while in a backup rotation sort of quality role. I'm cool with him being on the practice squad and potentially getting elevated. Moving on to the linebacker position. This is the one that's something's going to happen here. Something genuinely is going to happen here. Jack Campbell, Alex Anzalone, Derek Barnes, Jalen Reeves-Maybin, and Malcolm Rodriguez, I think, are completely and utterly safe on this roster. I believe they're going to be on the roster pretty much no matter what happens, unless they get hurt. Ben Niemann and Trevor Nowaski, who Trevor Nowaski was the player that the Lions claimed off of waivers from Arizona, I believe. I think it's very likely one of those two players, Niemann or Nowaski, are cut and trying to be added to the practice squad. I believe both of them would have to be waived. So I think what they're going to do is try to let the dust settle for both of them so that they're more likely to pass through the waiver wire, as teams have already filled their linebacker positions with other players, and now they no longer need to make a claim on Niemann or Nowaski, and then they can go ahead and default to the Lions practice squad. I believe that is the plan there. As far as other names that could make it onto the practice squad from the linebacker position, those would all be players that are not on the team or did not play for them this preseason. I think those will be outside names. However, I do still think it's very likely that one of Niemann or Nowaski ends up on the practice squad, opening a second potential roster spot for either Tim Patrick or potentially another defensive end to get added to this roster. So, as far as the cornerback position goes, 6 players made the roster outright. Carlton Davis, Terrion Arnold, and Amik Robertson, who are very likely to be the starting 3 corners, Robertson being in the slot, Carlton Davis and Terrion Arnold being on the outside. Rakestra will come in rotation. Kendall Vildor is high-quality depth at the position, and Khalil Dorsey, I believe right now, is most likely the player that is the on the depth chart, at least, backup nickel position. I think in reality, if Amik Robertson were to get hurt, Brian Branch in game would slide down to the nickel position, and they would bring either Joseph or Melanfanu off the bench to play the other safety role of Kirby Joseph. As far as the practice squad goes here, Stephen Gilmore is really the only name that I want to see brought back. He passed through waivers. I still think this has a quality depth piece written all over him. He's only in his second year, I believe, and I like to have him on the practice squad in case there is somebody on the outside to get hurt. I think he can come in and be a quality depth piece. And Emmanuel Mosley, unfortunately, once again, having a season-ending injury. That's 3 years in a row now, which is just horrible. But he is on IR. And interestingly, they have not put him on season-ending IR, but they have actually designated him to return. I don't know if that's what's going to happen or not, but it is interesting that they put him on IR, designated to return. Safeties, as far as those groups go, this one had another sort of shocking revelation. Brian Branch, Kirby Joseph, and Fatu Melifonwu are the three players that everybody kind of knew were making the roster. I think it was likely they were going to keep a fourth safety, and Brandon Joseph very, very clearly won that role during the preseason. Again, this is a guy that has a ton of upside. The final player that made the roster, which was a definitive shock to me, was Lauren Strickland. I didn't think he'd be making the roster. Genuinely, I thought it was going to be CJ Moore. I thought CJ Moore, if they kept five safeties, would have been the fifth safety. I don't think he particularly played all that bad during the preseason. And judging based on his history in the NFL, CJ Moore has been an elite quality special teams player, and honestly not that bad when he was actually playing the safety position. So just going based off of his history in the NFL, I thought CJ Moore was, if they kept five safeties, was likely the lock for that position. But Lauren Strickland is that guy, not CJ Moore. So that was very, very surprising to me. And as far as the practice squad goes, CJ Moore would be someone that I would definitely want to put on the practice squad, as well as Chellan Garnes, who was another young player. I believe he's a rookie that flashed in the preseason that the Lions reportedly are relatively high on. So that's another name that I maybe would like to see on the practice squad. And of course, we can't live out the specialties, the actual players that are the most important on the team: the kicking position, the punter position, and the long snapper position. These are almost universally the most important players on the football team. So we're going to spend the rest of this video, probably like 30 minutes or so, talking about this position group. That's why I did it last instead of first. No, obviously, I'm not going to spend that much time talking about this. Jake Bates won the kicking battle because everybody else got hurt. Jack Fox is one of the best punters in the NFL. And Hogan Hatton, being the long snapper and winning that competition, was relatively surprising, just because Scott Daly was a stalwart at that position, taking over for the guy that we had for like 20 years before that. But he won out, so that is good for him. But that's just me, and what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion, and it's at this point in the video I would like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point, or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. On Friday, we're going to come back with a first weekend of college football preview. I will miss some games on Thursday, but I'm not going to rush it to get it out before those games on Thursday. I have no interest in doing that. So come on back for Friday. We're going to talk about the first weekend of college football. And with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.